a little bit of the sequence of things, but that's okay. This is fine. We'll start recording now.
Okay, we are recording. Good morning, everyone. And we're back.
Good morning, everyone.
Are you ready for the next slide?
Yes, please. Right. So, so as I had just mentioned a little bit in my forward, we're speaking today on really muscular skeletal optimization. So bone density, musculoskeletal support, and also then how all of that interplays in regards to muscle tone, and within 8P diagnosis, the challenges that that can present. So, and then I know I'll just repeat here, generally from a disclaimer standpoint, this is just for general information, and anything that any of you who are listening are going to consider in terms of a change in treatment plan for your child, please consult your primary medical practitioner, right? So this is just for basic educational purposes. All right, so I guess first, before we even move to that first slide, I just want to say that in general, I think sometimes we think about just sort of bones as so solid, and our muscles, like this is just like our structure, right? And it's here to our bones are here to hold us up, and we might think of them as a little stagnant, so to speak, or just hard and fast, because they are the hardest part of our body. But they're so dynamic, and they're so critical to and foundational to this exchange with the rest of our body. So it is actually rather exciting. So I hope I can convey that in the period of time that we have together. So kids certainly are, as they're going through this, growth spurt during this time of their lives with rapid cell division, this is really our opportunity to build bone mass and density. You can go to the next slide, Katie, thanks. So I'm just gonna start with this whole concept of bone remodeling, right? Because certainly after we reach our full growth potential, our bones are still always turning over. And bone is very dynamic. And yep, that's perfect right there on the, so bone is very dynamic, and it's really made up of hard and soft tissue. And then certainly in the center of it is bone marrow, and we'll talk about all of that in a little bit more as well. So, but you've got in childhood, besides the density and the, occurring, you have also that growth occurring, right? And that growth is occurring in length and in width. Okay, you can go to the next slide here. So this whole remodeling component, right? So osteoblasts are, they're the cells that are building up bone, and osteoclasts are breaking down bone, and that is constantly happening. There's always this regeneration, and but as we're growing, the osteoblast activity is exceeding the osteoclast activity. And then as we age, that can begin to reverse. And that's why people tend to lose more, bone mass as they age. Again, very complicated subject matter. It involves not only the nutrition that is foundational to bone development and stimulating this osteoblast, osteoclast activity that for a good portion of our life kind of balances each other out to leave those bones pretty strong and vital. But, there's that endocrine component as well, and the hormones that are related to that. So next slide, because again, I can otherwise start providing a lot of added information too, and that's what happened last time. So again, with regards to just this changeover, there are also other functions involved, and this is why, from a developmental purpose, we start to move from, ideally, from crawling into walking and to weight bearing. And while why it's also important as we age to maintain isometric exercises. And then for all of the information that's in the news with this, you know, the space station and astronauts and the amount of time that they spend without weight bearing, you can lose up to 33% of your skeletal mass. And the same thing goes even with people who spend a lot of time swimming or very buoyant. While swimming is a great exercise and it's good for muscles, and the better your muscle tone and pressure on your bones, the better for your bones. That's that whole muscular skeletal interrelationship. But when you're buoyant and there's less pressure on the muscles, putting less pressure on the bones, there's less density occurring, and the osteoclast or breakdown component and the calcium leaching out aspect, you know, occurs. So we lose our bone density. And that's where over time, when you see, like, if you've ever seen like x-rays of people with osteoporosis, and it looks like Swiss cheese because the bones have lost that vital matrix or that solidness in there. And I say solidness, but remember, it's a living, flexible tissue. And of course, when kids are young, you know that their bones are a little bit more malleable. Otherwise, nobody'd ever even make it through the birth canal in terms of getting all, you know, and this is why the skull, right, fuses over time, etc. So again, just all of this about forces and pressure, because even that whole birthing process is designed to help then stimulate or activate that growth that's going to occur so rapidly after we're delivered. Okay, next slide. And I'm just going to look again at my notes. I kind of suffer from wanting to not give too much information to then giving too much information. Okay. So this, in terms of muscle mass, right? This particular study I grabbed because it was really more to do with, from a dietary standpoint, how protein and muscle development, and then this gets into the muscle tone component, is what is so in the literature, and this is just one, you know, very recent study looking at this, that you've got, it's really optimization of muscle mass that's going to, which can be directly related to total protein intake and absorption and assimilation, which is a lot of what we discussed last time with regard to gut function. But it's that optimization of muscle mass that is then going to optimize bone density and bone mass. And all of that goes together with strength. One other point to the bones, as I mentioned earlier, so they are like this, this more malleable living tissue, so to speak, not just the stagnant hard bone. But so within there is high mineralization, mostly calcium, and then and a lot of protein as the foundation, the big ticket items, let's say. Like the majority of calcium in the body, well, a lot of it's found in the muscle, and we need calcium throughout all of our cells to shuttle nutrients in and out of the cells, and also for our muscle contraction and relaxation. But the majority of the calcium is in our bones, where also a lot of protein gets pulled in. So from a dietary and foundational standpoint, that's important, especially if you're doing a dairy-free diet once your child's off of any kind of formula, because dairy is such a great way to get high dietary calcium. So without dairy, we just have to make sure that any non-dairy beverage or milk is going to be enriched, and or depending on what the base is, if it has some of its own calcium naturally, it's going to be fortified with additional calcium to bring it up to the point of where what milk might be delivering to the body. Although we can only absorb a certain amount of calcium at any one shot. So it does have to be divided up throughout the day, whether you're taking it in some oral food form or you're taking it supplementally. Katie, is it a problem for you to go back to the other slide format, just so I can see what's coming up next with the thumbnails on the left side of the screen? Perfect. Yeah, because that's, and I'm sorry, you know what I might do next time? I might just set up a separate computer where I can kind of regulate my own slides. So this way, when you're doing this through a shared screen, you can just show the full screen. So, all right. So, yeah, that's why I was just looking to see where we went next. So one other point that I just want to make in terms of the calcium being primarily in the bones, this is why when you look at your blood levels of calcium, the amount that's in the blood has to be a very tight level for regulation of body systems. So whatever the body needs, it's going to pull from the bone to make sure that that blood calcium level looks normal. So blood calcium level, unlike a lot of other blood parameters, is never a reflection of dietary calcium adequacy. That makes sense to everybody. So in other words, if your blood calcium level looks fine, that in no way means that you, or for your child, they're getting enough dietary calcium. That just means that there's enough in the bone at this point, and from a regulation of their endocrine system, because blood calcium is also regulated through the parathyroid glands that's also separate and apart from the thyroid, the parathyroid components, but that's regulated that way. But it's not a reflection of what's coming in dietarily is adequate. That's why as we age, and if we're going to do bone density tests, we need a bone density test. You can't just look at blood calcium levels to determine if you have enough good calcium in your system. So, so with that, now we can move over to some of these nutrients for bone growth, and I just want to make sure that okay, so I kind of broke this up between like macro and micronutrients, because otherwise I'm throwing a lot of terms around so just as a reminder, macronutrients are the proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, what provides us really with calories that then we can build from and burn energy, produce energy or ATP in our mitochondria from. And then we'll talk about like the micronutrients, which refer to basically the minerals and vitamins, the smaller components that we need in our diet. But this bone that I've been referring to and its interrelationship with muscle, I think you can hopefully appreciate just how dynamic it is. And it is this like living tissue. So besides in the bone having that harder calcium component, and as well as that softer connective tissue commingled in there, in the center of it, you have this rich marrow, which is making all of your blood cells. Your red blood cells responsible for oxygenating the body and carrying oxygen throughout the body. I think we always think about anemia and iron, right? But we still need optimal bone function to produce those red blood cells, which use iron at the center to make the hemoglobin to carry the oxygen. But there's an interrelationship here with regard to bone as well. And also it makes platelets in the marrow and the white blood cells. So we make white blood cells in our spleen and other parts of our body that are activated during an immune response. But we make these white blood cells, these lymphocytes, in our bone marrow. That's our immune system, which, again, I talked about that whole interrelationship of like neurological, the brain, the immune system, and all being in the gut last time. And that's why it was such a big, topic in terms of brain and brain support and cognition, and its interrelationship with the gut and the bidirectionality of that. Now we're really branching out in terms of this muscular skeletal system and how that communicates as well with, so they've got the bones and the marrow and the white blood cell production, and all of that is activated by the gut when there's a call for more immune response, so this again is why it's so important and vital every single day that we are building a solid nutritional base for intake. That how every day we don't want to miss opportunities for really good nutrition, because so much is at stake here. And this is why I get kind of like so excited about all these topics. Again, I just want to make sure I've already covered a lot of, so here's just the macronutrients for bone growth, right? So we need proteins. Of course, animal protein is fine, but because a lot of people are more focused on, both for environmental reasons as well as for health reasons, more plant-based, and that's excellent, but certainly lean, clean, well-sourced, humanely produced animal proteins are fine. But even from a vegetarian standpoint, the egg component, along with the beans and the nuts and the seeds for proteins. And then all the carbohydrates coming from that whole rainbow, literally, of vegetables and fruits. And then all your good fats. And the bone is using really a lot of protein, and then it's the mitochondria, or the powerhouse within the bone and the muscle, are using a lot of carbohydrates for conversion into ATP energy. And fat is important, and it's there to be supportive, certainly. Right, this was one thing I also had wanted to mention, that peak bone density really occurs before we hit 20, before we hit age 20. You've maxed out on the best your bones are ever going to be for your whole life. So these are critical windows of optimization and development. And sometimes when raising a child with special needs, and there's so much more to pay attention to, it's hard to keep your finger on all of these aspects, because we're always just dealing with what's right in front of us. But this optimal nutrition every single day is so vital, because it's your setup to then help prevent anything occurring later on in terms of, say, low bone density, risk to fractures with falls, because as we age, things do get a little more brittle. They're less malleable like the bones are when we're young. So, my mind flashes to times where like kids can take a real tumble and you're quite sure that something is broken, but thank goodness nothing is. And it's really because of just sort of that kind of still sort of spongy resilience. But that changes with age, and then we don't come to know maybe early onset of osteopenia or weaker bones, and then osteoporosis, or really those that are filled with those holes, so to speak, that are more likely to break until it's kind of too late. So up until age 20, we are building our peak bone density. And then the goal is to maintain that density throughout our life. And then generally, either through the powers of menopause or andropause, when that breakdown or that osteoclast activity starts superseding the buildup or the osteoblast activity in those cells, that's when you can get a little bit more weaker bones. But it's not like it's got to be sequential. It's not like Osteopenia has to come later in life, and it's not like osteopenia ever has to lead to osteoporosis, right? So there are always all these other factors that enter into play. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned about some of the benefits of plant-based foods, and one thing that we do, you always hear about in terms of more alkaline body, the more alkaline it is, even like the better for the bones that it is. That's because when we eat a lot of high sugary foods and even so much animal protein to the point of ketosis. Now, certainly, when you're just doing protein and fat without carbohydrates for ketosis, sometimes that is done for therapeutic reasons because there are benefits to be seen with regard to seizure control, so from a neurological standpoint, and or certain mitochondrial diseases, mitochondrial complex diseases, where the mitochondria actually regenerate and do better in this perceived state of starvation in the body, right? So that's a ketotic state. So those are higher fat, higher protein diets. Now, in those cases, when it's being used therapeutically, we do supplement with enough calcium, because that calcium is not only then being delivered to the bones, of course, but calcium is also more alkalizing, right? When we've even talked about the proton pump inhibitors like Nexium and Prilosec to stop stomach acid production. Well, long before those were around, right? If you had acid, you took calcium, right? That's what Tums and calcium-based Rolaids, because calcium is a great neutralizer, because it's going to make things a little more alkaline. So it's going to balance out that acid. So, of course, when you're not eating high sugar and you're not eating like predominantly animal proteins and you're eating a plant-based diet, your body's going to be more alkaline. And that, let me circle back now just to close this circle. Lots of trains of thought going through my mind right now. So thank you for your patience, because food and nutritional biochemistry is complex. So the thing is if our body is in this very acidic state, when we're eating a lot of animal protein and we're eating a lot of sugar, in the breakdown of those compounds, we make more acid. Now, because the blood doesn't like to be acid, it likes to be neutral, it's going to say, oh, where can we grab some calcium to neutralize our blood and keep our blood pH in a better place? We're going to grab it from this great source of calcium we have stored in the body, in the bones. Because even when a child is born, it has, pretty good skeletal mass and calcium, a calcium load from there, because it got it all from the mother. That's why women need to go into pregnancy with ideal bone optimization and good calcium intake before and throughout their pregnancy, and then afterwards while they're nursing. Not only for what's going to go to the baby, it's always going to go to the baby, but to maintain what they have for themselves, because otherwise it's a time of severe depletion for a woman. But so the body, when you're on this high acid diet, is going to steal from the bones to alkalize the body, right? All right, so when we're having a plant-based diet, it's more alkaline in general, all right? So all those vegetables are more alkalizing, because all those deep green leafy vegetables are very high in calcium and magnesium, and both of those are very alkalizing, as well as some other components. But then it starts to get a little sticky, because when you're doing a full plant-based diet, plants are also rich sources of these two compounds, phytic acid and oxalic acid, otherwise known as phytates and oxalates, right? Now, they're there for good reasons within the plant, and they can be okay reasons even for us as humans, especially like the phytic acid, right? Because the phytates can really run interference with iron absorption. And because iron can be toxic to the body, you want to make sure that you're not over absorbing iron. All right, so, but they run interference with absorption of nutrients. So that's why, again, even when somebody's a vegan, we have to be careful to make sure that they really are getting enough nutrients, because and that all those nutrients are being absorbed. We talked about kids with AP, like many children with developmental disabilities of any sort. When your body has to work that much harder for just normal function, right? To hold yourself up, to coordinate swallowing and chewing and digestion and movement, it increases stress on the cell. And that increased oxidative stress increases a call or demand for nutrients, because otherwise oxidation leads to inflammation. So we know that all these great antioxidants, as we've talked about last time especially, these antioxidants are going to help neutralize that oxidation and keep us in a less inflamed state, because otherwise we know that chronic inflammation leads to other disease states. So plants are wonderful, but they are complex. So we have to just be mindful about the phytates and the oxalates in plants. And some of you may be more familiar with oxalates if you've ever had a kidney stone. Then you know that, you could, because if you can't eliminate those oxalates very easily from the body, and you're not drinking enough water, they could precipitate out into the kidneys and form stones. Or they could land in the joints and make you a little achy. So that just made me think of something. Sorry, I'm gonna make a note first in terms of just checking on urinary oxalates. Okay, but nonetheless, you'd be, say, advised to maybe avoid spinach and almonds, which are great sources of oxalates. But they're also super great sources of plant-based calcium, and you'd even think of iron with regard to the spinach. But the iron and the calcium are going to compete for absorption. The body will preferentially absorb the calcium from that plant over the iron. And that's why sometimes vegans still need certainly supplemental iron. Okay, next slide, please. Are there any questions? Because it's already starting to get just a little deeper in terms of complication. And how are we on time, Katie?
We're at almost 7:40, so we're doing good. There are no questions in the chat. If you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and unmute
Right.
yourself too.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the reason I was calling for that right now in terms of questions is it's hard to not sound like I'm going to be favoring one type of diet over another. I have every respect for veganism, especially in this day and age, just from a planetary standpoint, until we could really learn to handle animal husbandry responsibly, which we haven't, and we're paying the price for from a planet at large. But really, some of these great nutrients for our body do come best from animal sources. But that's not to say that I'm just really pushing for, a meat-based diet either. I mean, I just think that's why I've also referred in the past couple of lectures on the Mediterranean diet, which is primarily plant-based, low inflammation, a lot of high omega-3 or anti-inflammatory fats, just to summarize that up in a soundbite, and small amounts of animal protein. So here is now another example of, this compound, a compound. I think I already talked about protein and ketosis, just checking my notes, guys. So the creatine does come primarily from animal protein. So people who are vegetarians and vegans do have lower amounts of creatine. And creatine, I made mention of, I believe, when I spoke about tone in the past, both creatine and L-carnitine, because carnitine, as even that name implies, like carnivorous or animal consumption, does come primarily from animal sources. Not that the body can't make the carnitine from plants, from amino acids from plants. But the idea is that we do need these compounds. And so like creatine in my head also sounds like you would know it's derived from an animal, because it's sort of one syllable away from creatinine. And creatinine, which you know probably from your own lab reports, is a measure of kidney function in terms of how well the kidney is doing in terms of eliminating protein waste from the body. So anyway, and people often confuse creatinine and creatine. But nonetheless, we've got this creatine, and even the L-carnitine, as I mentioned, is so vital to muscle function, and muscle function is so vital to optimal bone development and bone function that, you know, this is all of what's feeding, literally, figuratively, the mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell, which we can move to the next slide, which you guys, well, here's just a little bit of what I just said anyway on a separate slide. But if we can look to this next slide, that's a little bit more dynamic. This maybe looks familiar to you from last discussion, because the mitochondria is, our brain is so rich in mitochondria, our gut is so rich in mitochondria, because mitochondria are in every cell of the body, but they're really packed into this very, you know, these very dynamic body systems. So they're also really significant in muscle and bone. And so here again, just looking at these core nutrients that support the mitochondria, which supports the muscle and hence the muscle tone. I think my comments on muscle tone specifically were at the end of this discussion, but it all gets weaved in as we go throughout. So I'm going to just stop here to make sure that I can mention, and it's worth the repeat from what I even talked about last time. So even if looking at that caloric restriction component and how that will stimulate the mitochondria, that goes back to the reference I made a little while ago, that sometimes people are put on these ketogenic diets which mimic starvation in the body, where the body is using fat as its primary source of energy instead of glucose from carbohydrates, because it's been found to be beneficial to anyone with a mitochondrial dysfunction, where the mitochondria just isn't working properly. Now, that can be a primary condition, like a genetically inherited disorder. But what really makes it manifest, and also how it can develop even over time without a genetic predisposition, is when there is ongoing nutrient and hence mitochondrial depletion. Because the mitochondria serve to produce energy in the cell, which is vital. And I don't mean just like energy, get up and go energy. I mean the energy that's just essential to cellular function, just reproduction of cells and regeneration, like new stomach lining, like hair, skin, and nails, you know, healing a wound. I mean, all of this is what's necessary through mitochondrial, the mitochondrial. So, so this is where eliminating sort of excesses that may be associated with inflammation comes from with regard to caloric restriction. I'm not suggesting caloric restriction per se, especially to growing children. I'm just saying that comes under more the avoiding excesses, and where some of the science behind the ketogenic diet comes, even in terms of seizure control, like the modified Atkins diet or the ketogenic diet, because of the influence of mitochondria in the brain. And so the mitochondria are converting either fats or carbohydrates into primary energy. And they're also then responsible for eliminating all that metabolic debris as a result of that energy production out of the cell. So this is important from just cellular detoxification. The cruciferous vegetables, again, from even our discussion last time, all the sulfur and methane, methyl groups, the sulfur groups and methyl groups that are present in these cruciferous vegetables, all these additional antioxidants that help reduce all that oxidation and help support detoxification. The carnitine for energy production, because otherwise we don't really keep a lot of ATP energy in our cells, or maybe just little bits for short bursts. But if we want really sustained energy, we benefit from carnitine, the creatinine that I mentioned a little while ago, which isn't on this slide, and CoQ10 too. And so CoQ10, which is ubiquinol or ubiquinone, like the name suggests, it's pretty ubiquitous in our diet, and we can produce it even within our body. But the more demand on our body, and plus also as we age, if you wind up, any of you on a cholesterol lowering medication and many other medications, it tends to gobble up the CoQ10 in the cell. So sometimes we need to supplement to replace it, because now there's this extra demand for CoQ10, and then it leaves less for this energy production and detoxification within the cell. Because don't forget, if the cells have a lot of toxins built up, and I don't mean like the environmental toxins like pesticides and pollutants, I mean even just the cellular toxin, waste that's in our cell that hasn't been able to get out of the cell, to get dumped back into our systems, to be eliminated in our urine and our feces. So we need this is again why we need all these nutrients on hand, ideally all of the time. And certainly exercise helps stimulate the mitochondria, and that also gets into optimizing muscle tone and optimizing bone density, like that weight bearing exercise. So, but all of this healthy mitochondria is really then, it's within the cells of the bone, which now we can move to the next slide. In a growing child is all what fits this whole sequence of event of blood flow and blood vessels and protein and calcification and bone growth. So as I said, it's going back to the beginning and just coming always back around for all these points, for all the dots to be connected, in other words, that you've got increase in bone length and bone width, and then bone density. And then within that innards of the bone with that marrow, how vital that is for the production, as I said, of red and white blood cells and platelets. Okay, so next slide. All right, so the micronutrients. And as I think I've talked a lot about calcium already in terms of bone being primarily calcium, but I have to tell you, don't let that fool you, because without magnesium and phosphorus and boron, and then the vitamins that I'm going to talk about in a moment, you wouldn't have bones. So yes, there's a lot of calcium in the bones, but bones are not made of calcium alone. And of course, there's concern sometimes about excess calcium, right? And how that calcium, that's why I said you really want to just take what you need in the course of a day and spread it out throughout the day so that it's only enough for the body to absorb it and put it where it needs to properly. Because if you get a big glut of calcium all at one time, you can't get that uptake into the bones optimally. It's too much, even if you have enough vitamin D on hand. And we're going to talk about the vitamins in a minute. I wanted to cover the minerals first. So, because certainly you need that vitamin D to get the calcium into the bones. But even if you have enough on hand, if there's too much calcium, there's only so much that's going to go in at one time. And the rest just stays in circulation. And it can wind up settling in places where it's not supposed to. So if you happen to be taking a lot of calcium and you happen to be an oxalate producer and be having a diet high in oxalates, and you get dehydrated, you might wind up forming a kidney stone, which is calcium oxalate. So, of course, kidney stones can also be uric acid based, but those are and uric acid comes from certain protein foods, especially that are higher in purines. But that is the smaller type of kidney stone found. Like, don't quote me on percentages, but let's just say 90% of kidney stones are calcium oxalate stones. So another reason to be mindful about calcium. The other thing is that from an absorption standpoint, and less likely to form stones, is when that calcium is in the citrate form. And I talked about calcium citrate even in the constipation lecture, because citrate naturally helps to soften stool. Whereas the carbonate form of calcium, like what you find in a Tums, can be a little more binding. So if you or a child needs a calcium supplement and they tend to be more constipated, then you want to select the calcium citrate. Magnesium dietarily, because you can give any of these things supplementally, but dietarily, magnesium is coming from all your deep green leafy vegetables. So, as well as other sources too, but primarily in your greens. Phosphorus also is rather ubiquitous. It's coming from your greens, all your greens and vegetable sources, and it's also coming from grains and even the pseudo grains. So if your child is on a grain-free diet or a gluten-free diet, they're still going to be getting it from like quinoa and buckwheat. And if your child, for any reason, there's also phosphorus in animal products too. So even if you're doing a ketogenic diet. But generally speaking, sometimes it's always good and important and necessary to round out dietary intake with selected supplement support. And boron as well. We usually get enough dietary boron. So the vitamin components, that's in the next slide. Just want to see if I had anything else that, as I made mention earlier about the phytates and the plant-based foods, besides binding with iron a lot, they also tend to bind with phosphorus often. So again, food's complex, which is why we want a big variety of it, and we want to rotate as much of that variety in the course of a day and a week and a month and a year. And that's why if you have a child who's a very picky eater, which we talked about last time as well, their diet's going to be very more limited than what they can get in to really get this whole bounty of nutrients that is ideal for the body and all its systems. And that's where a very robust, well-rounded, high-quality multivitamin and mineral supplement is going to be important. So it goes beyond just, some popular name brand that might be, a little more full of artificial ingredients, perhaps from a flavor enhancement standpoint, and just have a smattering of certain nutrients. So even if you find something that's clean and organic with just a smattering of, we always want to go clean and non-GMO and organic and food sourced as much as possible when we're selecting nutrients. But I will say it's hard to get everything that you need in just one multivitamin and mineral. You're certainly not going to get enough calcium because, you know, a calcium supplement or even powdered calcium, it takes up a lot of mass. So it's not going to fit in just like one chewable multivitamin that's also trying to get in the vitamins as well as the minerals. So just select wisely and talk to your, you know, healthcare provider. If your child is getting any kind of like formula support, like say from a Kate Farms or a Neo Kate, there's going to be an ample amount of vitamins and minerals added to that formula. So that will help compensate for sure. All right, so also carrying on about the micronutrients. So we talked about minerals, now also looking at the vitamins. So vitamin D, as I made mention, and if you don't know where your child's vitamin D level is to know how much supplementation may be necessary, you may, the next time they get bloods drawn, if you're going to look at ferritin or iron stores, you want to look even at vitamin D levels. Normal range is 30 to 100. You really want to aim for around 50 all the time, year round, because you could have your vitamin D level checked at the end of August and it's 32 and you're like just told it's normal. But if you're not supplementing and you live somewhere where you have winter, 6 or 8 months of winter, and you're going into your winter now at just a 32, you can bet by the time you get to March, you're going to be down in the teens and 20s. It's not going to be enough vitamin D to adequately support the immune system, the brain, and the muscular skeletal system, because you really want a normal value somewhere in that 50 range, plus or minus, let's say 10, right? 40 to 60, right there between that 30 to 100. So that's a good place to modulate. Vitamin K, which we also get from our deep green leafy vegetables. Vitamin E that you get from your nuts and seeds. Vitamin C that you get from vegetables. And you also get certainly from your fruits, from berries. People think of citrus, but you can get a lot of vitamin C from strawberries and all fruits really outside, even outside of, not so much apples, but, and pears, but certainly citrus and berries, kiwi, peaches, plums also. They're gonna, so the peaches and apricots, everything in that orange family, orange yellow family is high in vitamin A. And I'll just skip down to vitamin A for a minute because those plant sources of vitamin A are beta carotene. The body can take that beta carotene and make just enough vitamin A out of it as the body needs. When you're taking supplemental vitamin A, sometimes they're going to give you the straight vitamin A, which is what we get from animal sources, from like egg yolk and chicken livers, cod liver oil, although nowadays a lot of times, so that people aren't going to get too much of that animal sourced A, they kind of pull out the A and they put just enough back in so you're not getting too much. And that's because excess vitamin A can actually be bad for bones. So, so you just want to watch the amount of, you'll see it as retinol palmitate or retinol acetate as opposed to beta carotene or the plant source of vitamin A. You could get a little bit of both. Some of the better multivitamins might say that you're getting 100% of vitamin A, 25% from the retinol form, and 75% from the beta carotene form. And then everything else you get from diet is just bonus, and that is fine also. Then the B vitamins, which are essential for mitochondrial function and converting macronutrients into energy, and B vitamins essential for our adrenals, which make our, you know, our stress hormones, and of course proper stress hormones too. It doesn't always have to be bad stress, just walking and that energy that it takes, right? That's a stress, so to speak, on the body. It's a good stress, but it's going to require energy. And some of that energy, of course, is coming from that endocrine system, the adrenal glands, the thyroid glands. We need these robust B vitamins, which thankfully are quite ubiquitous in our diet. But some of us, many of us, don't methylate or convert, say, some of these B vitamins into their active form. So that methyl groups are coming in from our deep green leafy vegetables, or you might be taking a multivitamin or giving your child one that contains methyl B12 or methylcobalamin or methylfolate. Okay, let me just take a look if there was anything else on my notes. I know we ran very late last time, so this time I'm trying to be more mindful.
Mary, there was actually a question if there's a multivitamin that you recommend.
I mean, in general, I think that the VitaSpectrum from Claire Labs does a very nice job. And it comes in a very, listen, it's vitamins, right? So of course it's gonna have a flavor, but they don't add any sweetener to it, but they will add natural, non-MSG based flavors. So it comes either as a berry pomegranate, which would mix very nicely, like with a little bit of like an organic grape juice, or it comes in an orange flavor, if for a little bit of orange juice or some pureed peaches or something to mix in with. That's in a powdered form. There are some chewables. The Springboard from Orthomolecular. What the heck is the name of theirs? I can't think of the brand name, but Orthomolecular has a pediatric brand of supplements. Orthomolecular has that pediatric brand called Springboard, and within Springboard there's a chewable children's multivitamin that's got a nice composition, and for chewables and then the powders I mentioned, the Claire Labs VitaSpectrum, and even Metagenics has like a chewable one that's more like a Starburst consistency, whereas the one from Orthomolecular Springboard is a hard crunch. I'm just trying to think of the different ways to deliver higher quality multivitamins. Hard chew, oh, and then there's some gummies, but gummies wind up taking up so much space to add all the gumminess that you normally need like 2 or 3 or 4 to get the equivalent of what you really need. It's not like there's a gummy that packs so much in, it would just be too big. So, and I think that that's just a lot of gummy exposure for teeth. But anyway, those are just some, but you could email me as well. And if you didn't get any of that, or you have some specific criteria that you're looking for. It's hard to find a good liquid that doesn't have some type of preservative in it. So what I usually suggest are the powders, and just if you want them as a liquid, you just mix them with a little bit of water, because they could even be syringed in, rather than going with a liquid that has to be consumed within a certain amount of time and always shaken up to make sure you're getting equal distribution of everything, and then they're in the refrigerator and sometimes you forget. So okay. Next slide, I guess. All right. Oh, so this.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. As I said, I'm not looking at the chat. So if there's any, I can actually click on chat here too, just to see if there's, oh no, I can't. That's your screen, silly me. I hate these things. All right. Anyway, here's just a basic summary chart that I pulled from, and you could see that this is actually a rheumatology journal, right? Because all these parts of the body and all these systems are all interrelated. But here, it's a nice summary of, again, the macros that I was talking about, referring primarily to protein, as I front loaded in the beginning of this discussion. And then some of these micros that I just chatted to you about. Although I didn't mention zinc specifically. And zinc we talked about last time, because it's so vital to gut integrity and hence immune function. And of course, it's very important as well in terms of optimal bone matrix. But many of these minerals compete for absorption with one another. So as I said, iron and calcium compete, and that's why you can't find a lot of both in one multivitamin. And many moms will know that too, just from prenatal situations where you're taking your prenatal, but you still might have needed extra iron and or extra calcium. You know, the extra calcium and magnesium is often recommended too if women were having like muscle cramps and stuff during pregnancy. So that's why sort of splitting everything up, you do the best you can with a good, well-rounded multi, but that's why you still need all the dietary support, so that if your body only captured half of the zinc that was offered in the multi, then hopefully it's grabbing some other zinc later on in the diet from nuts and seeds. And then I think, so next slide, I think I had some other considerations. We already talked about acid and base. Right, so, all right, so I mentioned about the weight bearing a bit, but sleep is vital for the production of growth hormone. And growth hormone, as I was talking about the endocrine system, primarily with regards to vitamin D, which is a vitamin, but it kind of acts like a hormone. And then also just in terms of when I made mention of like andropause and menopause and its influence on bone and muscle function. But when you're a little one growing your muscular skeletal system, it's all about the growth hormone, then stimulating the growth plates for the long bone growth. And you need sleep to do that. Besides nutrition, you need sleep. And if your child has very disrupted sleep, which they might, especially if they're very constipated and backed up, like all of this all goes together, they can be missing out on vital growth opportunity. So optimizing sleep is very important. And that's where even a little bit of melatonin supplementally, and again, speak with your healthcare provider, can really be beneficial. It'll help with that deeper, richer sleep, which will allow for optimal growth hormone production and growth during sleep and growth throughout the following day. And then that melatonin gets kind of converted then into dopamine for attention and focus and freshness and alertness the next day. I made mention about the proton pump inhibitors cutting down on stomach acid, and how we then historically beforehand used to take calcium as a neutralizing agent. Before there was even Tums as a heartburn remedy, people just kind of drank milk because they were feeling like, oh, it coated the stomach if they had like an ulcer or heartburn. But when you suppress stomach acid, you're going to reduce the amount of nutrients that you can absorb. So that's why chronic use of Prilosec, Nexium, even the H2, the histamine blockers like Tagamet or Pepcid, Zantac, things like that, they're reducing stomach acid. Anyone who's, and it's important to put that fire out, but long-term use and reliance is cutting down on stomach acid, which runs interference with absorption of B vitamins and minerals, especially calcium. So for older people who've been on, say, a proton pump inhibitor like Nexium, like for forever, and then their bones are, you know, are not remodeling as they were when they were younger, and they're not getting that calcium absorption, there's greater risk of fracture, and that's one of the side effects noted on long-term use of those proton pump inhibitors. And that's just one example. There are even certain seizure medications that are going to run interference with different nutrient mineral absorption. So just be familiar with the drug nutrient interactions for any medication that your child is taking, and you may need to mitigate that interaction with supplemental nutrients. But sometimes those supplemental nutrients have to be taken away from the medication. So again, that's something for a little bit more personalized nutrition assessment and guidance. So speak to your healthcare provider on that. And then I think the last slide that I had was really everything that I kind of mentioned already, just sort of summarizing all of this in terms of muscle tone, which again, from previous conversations, this is just the culmination. We know how muscle tone presents, right? Everything that I mentioned here. And then of course, this added energy expenditure when I note the mixed tone, because when you're very hypertonic, you sometimes have to summon up more rigidity elsewhere to compensate. You have to get stiffer or more hypertonic in extremities in order to lift a very hypotonic truncal area and move that total body mass. And when you're doing all of that, you're putting more stress on the muscles and bones, which is okay, providing all the nutrients are on hand to support those mitochondria to make those muscles and bones respond properly without getting depleted. And this is where daily dietary and nutrient support is essential. And I hope I accomplished that and got kind of pulled it all together to the best of my ability without being overly wordy or confusing. And I think that's what I have to say on this subject right now. And certainly I'm open to questions and answers for you guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Jerry. Go ahead and unmute yourself, you guys, if you have a question, or you can post it in the chat too.
See, I never know how much information anyone's coming to the table with. So I'll apologize for information being too basic, and I'll also apologize for getting too complicated. I'm not really sure where I land in that whole pendulum. So hopefully, though, there were some pearls that you will find applicable, most certainly to your child, but then maybe to yourselves as well and families as a whole.
Do we have any questions?
All right.
No.
I don't know ultimately how many were able to join us today, but I know it was, as I said, a small group, but hopefully everybody got something out of it. And that if others are watching this as a recording, you can feel free to email me at that email address. And it's not just scheduling, it's really just the best way to get to me. And if you have any questions, then I'm happy to answer them for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jerry. And thank you everyone for coming and participating. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. You guys have a great day.
Yes, we'll see you at the next one.
See you at the next one. Bye now.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, Katie. Thanks.